For joining today and welcome to this Kronosub webinar on citation misconduct. My name's Romy Beard. I'm the head of publisher relations at Kronosub, and I've been running these webinars for 3 years now. So they're usually panel webinars that try and get different perspectives from different stakeholders in the industry, tech providers, publishers, institutions, libraries, researchers sometimes, on various topics of relevance that I think are interesting to explore. So the webinar today, as all webinars, will be recorded and we'll put the slides online, so you don't need to take tons of notes. You can go back and watch it later on. And if indeed you're watching this later, thank you for watching. So the topic for today's webinar is citation misconduct, helping authors keep their papers clean. Now, obviously, there's lots of different types of citation misconduct that we can have, and Nick has got a beautiful detailed slide for the very end that will get into really all the different intricacies. But obviously, it can be something very basic, from an error in a citation, a typo, to including a fake citation that might have been generated by AI, or even a relevant citation that aren't actually supporting the material that you're talking about. And we'll get into all of that a little bit throughout. So who do I have with me today? We've got 3 speakers. We've got Inka Neta from the University of Dundee, the Research Integrity Lead. And she will talk from the institutional perspective and give us a nice introduction about why we cite, why researchers cite. Then we'll have Catherine Goodman from the American Chemical Society. And the idea for this webinar really originated because Catherine and me had a chat, and the perspective that she made me aware of is of use cases where authors are being asked to include citations by peer reviewers where it might not be relevant, and what authors can do about that. So she'll get into that side of it a little bit. And then to finish off, we'll have Nick Morley from Grounded AI, who will talk about what different tech companies in this space are doing, including his own organization. So in terms of format, we'll have each one present for about 5 to 8 minutes on the different topics, and then we'll have a group discussion. If you have any questions, please pop them in the Q&A and we'll get through them after the presentations. And if you have any comments, please feel free to use the chat. And that's it for me. So I'll hand over to Inka.
Well, welcome, and thank you, Romy, for asking me to join this. And I really enjoyed meeting Catherine and Nick, and I look forward to a really interesting hour. So what I'm going to do is set the scene a little bit and share with you my ideas about citations, and also what we as the University of Dundee do to help teach our students and our staff about this. And I thought I'd start with what I thought was really interesting, and I use this in my teaching on this, plagiarism. I think it's really funny that it comes from the Latin kidnapper. To plagiaros is a kidnapper. So it was originally used very differently, but it extended its meaning to include people who stole words, not just children. And of course, that is the root of the word, and that's how we use it today. And it's basically the unacknowledged use of another's work as one's own. And that goes from plagiarizing blatantly, taking whole texts and or summarizing someone's work that they have written without just changing, not in one's own word, copying work, and of course, using another's idea without acknowledging that. And if you go to the next slide, what you see is common to all these is the acknowledgement of others people's work. And that is really what citations are about. So in the next slide, it's just a tiny, it's not comprehensive, and my colleagues will expand on this, is what is citing? Why do we cite? It's a professional practice. Scholarly work involves this. We cite sources, and it's a standard practice. And so we credit the original work or the creators of ideas by acknowledging their work and showing that we understand it. This doesn't just include text, this includes images, graphs, and it also guides readers to original sources, giving them the ability to critically evaluate what's gone on before. It gives writers, people who write scholarly works, an opportunity to provide supporting evidence for their arguments using previous work. And of course, it avoids the plagiarism that I mentioned by accurately showing who was responsible for those ideas if it wasn't me, the author of something, of what we're looking at. And if we go to the next slide, as the research integrity lead of the university and also in the school, and having been embedded in this type of work for quite a while, this is very much in line with the various things we expect the members of our scholarly community to do, the behaviors, the aspects of what we want people, what we mean by professionalism. So that includes integrity, the objectivity. I always say, you know, the data is the data. It's really simple. You may not like it. There may be a data point you don't like, or there's a citation. Actually, there's a text that might say, well, this is not quite right, but that is how we work. The data is the data. And if we say exactly how we got it, then that's what we do, transparency. So that's the honesty, including the acknowledgement of sources and information, having respect, listening to others' opinion is all part of that. And the fact that we have a responsibility to society, which includes our funders, charities, taxpayers, to report our work accurately, which includes acknowledging previous people's work, and also making sure that what we communicate, including the sources we cite, help us to be reproducible. So we create the solid foundation that we want work to be so others can build on it. So just on the next slide, it's just a very, very short, and it's not comprehensive, but just give you some examples. How do we teach our students to cite? Because many of them may have done this, although, you know, kids learn this in school now. My kids knew in 3rd grade that copying other people's work without attributing it was not okay. But we still have to make sure we teach people also how to cite. We have lectures at every level where we mention this, where we give examples. They usually include some practice sets. We have workshops, and for our PhD students, we have writing workshops that include examples of citation. We have an external person coming in who does a fantastic job. We have handbooks where we again reiterate that. And we also, just on a bigger picture, I try to have open meetings regularly with the community, with other research integrity leads, to talk about integrity and the issues, giving examples of what can go wrong and not. And in my last slide, I'm just going to lead into what's going to come next. So what are the problems and issues? I mean, AI is going to come up. I didn't put that in here. But some of the major issues are, who do we cite for what? Who really was the original or the originator of an idea that then laid down a field? There are often cabals in fields that say, oh, this was the right person. This can relate to friendships or where you happen to be or which paper you read first. So there are differences of opinion, and often that kind of cronyism can then perpetuate because I trained with that person and they always cited this. And anyway, so who really was first is not always so easy. And I think a solution is then to say, well, there were 2 people or whatever, but going back, how far back do we go? What's right or wrong? It's not so clear. And the problem really is that citations are often received, and the citations when received are a reward. Our reward system pushes us to some of the things that are bad and that we're going to hear about. And all of that is really introduces bias in the system. And I think this is where AI tools hopefully might be helpful, but I think it's really complicated. And I look forward to hearing more about that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Inka. Yeah, I just thought this threw the thought out there. I wonder if anyone's done any analysis about, you know, citation misconduct and how that has, you know, shot through the roof since the impact factor has taken off. So because that's obviously one of the reasons we see a lot of those issues.
You know, with Dora, this should have gotten better, but I think it's going to take.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. That was great for setting the scene. So we'll go straight into the next talk by Catherine. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you so much for inviting me, Romy. I'm super excited to hear the discussion. And as you noted, I've been in publishing for getting on to 20 years now. And one of the things that always made me kind of sad as an editor myself is seeing how authors really felt constrained, that they had to do what the referee said, even if it didn't make sense, and that we need kind of a publisher agnostic author bill of rights to help authors kind of reclaim some ownership of their paper. And I touch on that a little bit at the end, but that's kind of my interest and motivation here. If you go to the next slide, the information I'm going to share is probably very basic for anyone who's interacted with a publisher or published a paper, but just again to kind of level set, make sure we're all on the same page. So once authors have done all of their work to properly cite things based on Inca's fabulous advice, they submit their manuscript, and then basically the references are used in a lot of different ways throughout the publishing process. So editors are looking at the references to understand, is this work of high impact at some journals? Is the novelty of the paper what the authors are claiming, or are there citations that would limit the novelty of the work, etc.? Referees also will be interested in that question and may have a deeper dive because they're subject matter experts, or even more subject matter experts than the editors, as to what papers have come out in the field recently. The referees also are doing a really careful look at what experimental techniques are being cited and reported. Is the data complete so future researchers can reproduce the work and they can assess whether the conclusions in the paper hold, etc. Once the paper is finally published, of course, it completes the scientific literature that Inca was speaking about, helping to show who came first, who built on what, where do things diverge, where do they come together, etc. Next slide, please. So in the olden days, when there were actual printing presses, and then, even when journals were still being printed and mailed out to libraries and researchers, the references were originally constrained, primarily because publishers didn't want to have to lay out hundreds and hundreds of citations, or they couldn't, fit it into a page budget, etc. Also, they had to manually verify all of those citations being accurate. We have, as we'll hear more about the amazing new tools that are coming out from Nick, we have some, even basic tools now that help to confirm this DOI is a meaningful DOI or convert it to the actual citation, etc. So basically the production side of it is now pretty solved. There are some manual interventions required still, but scaling up from 20 to 300 references, which is the example I gave to my production colleague, he was like, that's not a big deal these days. So so what has been the implication of that? And you'll see on the next 3 slides, kind of the way that might kind of creep out in the real world. So these are just 3 ACS journals. This analysis was done for a separate purpose, but my colleague Greco was kind enough to share these slides with me. So here's one journal where the limit is 70 references. You can see most authors are still within that limit and following the rules. On the next slide, you'll see one where the creep is starting to get a little bit more. So the majority of authors are still within the limits, but the tail is getting much longer. And on the next slide, you'll see an example where basically the limit, which is, the line at 50 references, that green shaded area, is just completely irrelevant to this community. They're not paying attention to it at all. The vast majority of authors are well beyond the limits. So actually, that's the reason that we did this analysis, is thinking about which journals need to just do away with their limits. They clearly don't care. So helping us there. So as we think about kind of expanding, what is the possibility for including all references? What do the references really accomplish? And what are the constraints now? Obviously, the printing press is way out the window, but now basically editors and referees need to check these lists and make sure, are the right papers included? Are none of the wrong papers included? How does this paper reflect the current literature? Next slide, please. When the referees do get back to the authors with their feedback, often they will include some suggestions for new references. What Inca called kind of the possible cronyism, maybe in a positive light, is kind of more an awareness bias, right? Like if you're over in the red group of researchers, this is kind of just an illustrative image of kind of demonstrating in a scientific community, there can be different pockets of people who are more or less familiar with each other's work. So if you're in this red community and you get a referee who's from the green community, they might be shocked that you haven't included the most obvious citations from that group, but everyone's got positive intent. It's more a question of, like Inka said, whose papers did you get trained up on as you started your PhD, et cetera. Obviously, if the referees know about concerns with any of the citations or retractions or other ethical issues, it's great if they can flag that. If they know about additional papers that are timely and highly relevant that should be added and help to either support the author's arguments or might raise questions that the authors should address, it's great if they mention those. And then I've flagged 2 things in red here that make things a little complicated. So I've seen several cases where an editor or referee says, I know of a paper that was actually in this same journal that would be appropriate to cite. Obviously, it's unethical to demand that someone cite a paper in your own journal. So it can be a real tricky balancing act of when is it appropriate? And in most cases, people lean towards, let's just leave that one out. Hopefully the authors will find it of their own accord at some point. And then the last red was meant to be kind of its own bullet there, but obviously the inappropriate gaming of the system, wanting to just add citations that are not relevant to improve someone's H-index, et cetera. We know that's why we're having this webinar. We know it happens, but obviously is inappropriate. Next slide. So again, this graph is kind of for illustrative purposes, just to show we all know the scientific literature is expanding exponentially. And so literally it is not possible for an author to cite all of the references that are relevant to their field. And this kind of goes back to Inka's question of how do we decide what to cite? That's the central tenet here. So if authors get a request for new references that they think make sense and they are within journal limits, if the journal is enforcing those limits, great for them to add those. And I think again, back to my point of this author Bill of Rights idea that authors should feel more empowered to decline to add new references if they don't feel like this was really the first, this is a new angle that we're not covering through our other citations. If they've already cited 5 papers in the field, and these are 3 more out of the remaining 500. It's kind of arbitrary which of those 3 get picked. So wanting authors to feel like they have that agency to be thoughtful and say no, thank you. Of course, authors should alert the editor if the references really do seem to be inappropriate. It seems like the referee is again doing that gaming of the system. That's feedback that the editors might not have picked up on in a cursory reading of the referee reports. And so we need that communication. And next, and this is my last slide. So again, I just want to really highlight that editors have to be aware that authors feel pressure to do what they're asked, especially if they feel like they need to say no to some experimental requests. This is an easy one where I can just say yes and make it less confrontational with the editor that I'm pushing back on everything. And so editors have to have that forefront in their mind that authors, if they do push back, editors really need to take a close look and say, gosh, they really had a good reason to say these references didn't fit in their paper. And then again, if the authors do raise any concerns, really look carefully at that. If the referee is misbehaving, sometimes you can say, hey, this was out of scope, do some education. In other cases, you just may need to say, let's put that referee on our list of people not to reach out to again. We don't trust that they're doing an ethical job. So that's the end for me. And now I'm super excited to hear how Nick's presentation is going to help us move to an even better future of appropriate citations.
Thanks, Catherine. Before I hand over to Nick, can I just ask one question?
Of course.
You've had the examples of journals that have limits of how, like 50 citations or 70 citations limit. Is this just to rein it in so it's not going crazy? Why did you come up with those numbers? What was the process?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of those limits carry over from, 20, 30 years ago when that was enough. And I think we haven't taken a hard look at really what would be a meaningful number to correctly represent the field. And maybe I'll prompt Nick that he could answer the same question based on what he sees. But I think it's a reasonable question of what is the appropriate number? Is it 50? Is it 300? Is it, we have some new tool that you just click through and it shows you, and you can interact in some way with the many thousands of papers that are possibly related. I think it's a huge issue that we have not tackled appropriately.
Yeah, it comes back to the question of why do we cite, and do we need to cite
Right.
everything that's come before, and with there being more content all the time, it could
Right.
500. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks for answering that.
Thank you.
All right. I'll over to Nick then. It's all yours.
Yes, thanks, Romy. So I'll follow on from Catherine's prompt there. I think, so I'm coming at this from a technology perspective, and I'm going to get to the tools around what we can use here. But I think there's a big distinction here, and there's a lot we can do with technology, but there's also this very large question of what the tools should do and what the thresholds should be and what the standards should be. And I'm just as keen as anyone else here to learn or to help contribute to or agree on what the tools should exactly be doing. And I think that's very much up for debate. And I'd like to learn more about people's views on that during the discussion. But so my background on this is I come from research. So I have a neuroscience degree. I was in biomedical research. I spent many years in big pharma. So a lot of my training and career has revolved around the scientific literature. And I'm now a co-founder of Grounded AI. And we are building tools to help publishers and institutions check papers for citation inaccuracies. So I've been fully focused on this issue for some time. If you'll go to my first slide, please, Romy. I wanted to start with a bit of data following on from the example of Catherine, because a lot of people I talk to about this, people are invariably surprised still about how prevalent of an issue this is. And I'm actually continually surprised about it myself. Every week there's new crazy examples coming up in the news. But this has been quite well studied, and it's not new. I've quoted a couple of papers here, and I can share more offline. The numbers vary around this, but I think it's fair to say they are invariably provocative. And I think there are many reasons to expect this to rise. We've already heard the use of AI mentioned today, but I think it's important to note that the growing use of AI has what we call this tendency to hallucinate, and certainly with citations, it's no exception, and that's been studied as well. As you can see, AI makes up everything. It makes up citations as well, so some awareness around that. Now, of course, the question is, what are the different types of citation inaccuracy? And I think that's the glaring question when you start looking at these studies. You know, what are they actually saying when they say citation inaccuracy? So you can carve this up in many different ways, and people have in the literature, but I've tried to chart out a view of the different types of citation issue that we see and are currently working to detect every day with our tools. So just to skirt over some of these categories, in the top left, you have this notion of bias and overrepresentation, and this has already been brought up, but this is who and what you cite and to what degree. So you can cite yourself overly, you can cite a network or ring of other authors overly, you can bias towards certain journals, certain affiliations, or even your own country. And these are things which editors are very interested in because they can signal bias, not just in sort of the incentives around citation metrics, but also how well researched are you, how broad is your understanding of the research space. So this is a variety of reasons you might oversight one author or another. In the bottom, in orange, you have the simple issue of metadata, and Catherine's mentioned some of this stuff around metadata, but have you got the right year and authors? Have you got the right DOI? Does that actually match the reference you're talking about? And this is a common and honest category of errors that can and do happen. If you go to the bottom left, you've got the question of which sources you're citing. And are they of the expected quality given the standards of the journal? So you can cite sources which may have credibility issues. Having been retracted is an obvious one. If you go to the middle left, you've got the question of whether you've included sufficient citations to substantiate your claims. So you might be missing better or newer references, which might better support your claims, or you might be excluding evidence that actually might contradict or balance your claims or your arguments, and we call that cherry picking. So that's another way you can go wrong. Coming to the top right, you have the question of whether the cited sources are indeed relevant and supporting. And Romy brought this up right at the beginning. It's a really interesting area which we're studying. I call this alignment. I think the jury I think it's yet to be decided how exactly we define this, but this includes irrelevant citations or citations which are not accurately represented by the authors. So the final thing, which also, again, AI, the middle right, I've got fabrication or non-existent sources. So are the sources you're citing even real? A hallmark of AI usage might be fabricated or hallucinated sources in the paper. So how many ways are there to get it wrong? There are lots of ways to get it wrong. If you'll go to the next slide, please, Romy. Hit it once again. So a couple of examples. I'm not going to show any really juicy or egregious examples from the field today. You can find plenty of those in the news online, but this is a sensitive issue. I've pulled a couple of screenshots from our tool Veracity, which does citation checking. So I just want to give you a feel of how the tools we're using are shaping up around this problem today. So this is a tool that can identify citations in the text and analyze the relevance and support of those citations. And that will help draw the reviewer's attention to any that might have concerns or can't be verified. And so this example I'm showing here, this is actually AI generated content, and it contains a source that we can't resolve, and so is very likely fabricated in this case. Another example, if you go to the next slide, please, Romy. So this is an example from real human-generated content. Special thanks to Will Fortin at Hum for letting us use this example. And this is an example where we're flagging up an instance of where our system can't find the data being referenced in the author's text. And the author might have a very good reason for this, and indeed they do, because we know the author, and this result generated some great discussion. So this is one of my favorite examples of both how sensitive these new tools can be, but also the subtlety around citation usage. And that's the open question is, what's right and what's wrong? I think we need to use these tools to help stimulate discussion between authors and reviewers. And this is a great example of that. And if you're interested in more examples, connect with me offline. Just also to mention, speaking of Hum, if you're interested in all the other exciting ways AI is being leveraged in scholarly publishing, I recommend talking to Hum. Dustin Smith would be a great contact there. If you go to my final slide, please, Romy. So I wanted to end with a broader view of the landscape of tools in the ecosystem. So I've organized this into 4 quadrants. On the left, I've got tools that are more focused on authors, like writing assistants. You'll recognize Grammarly, referencing managers, everyone's got their favorite, research tools, which are increasingly AI-based. And on the right, I've got tools which are really focused more on the publishers and their workflow. And to the top, I'm talking about integrity, and that's about detecting misconduct and plagiarism and AI usage. But on the bottom, we've got quality. And I think that there's a larger question here. There's a gray area really between quality and integrity. And I think the reason I wanted to put this visualization is to say that right now in the middle there in peer review, there's this really exciting new space of tools which have this quadruple responsibility, right? They have to help publishers maintain the highest quality standards and integrity standards, but they also have to help authors be able to do their best work, get the best feedback, give them the best chance possible. So I know that one of the topics for discussion today was who should have access to which tools. So I wanted to end with this and let Romy take us into the discussion.
Thanks so much, Nick. I'm going to stop sharing so I can see you all and I can see the questions. There you are. I just had to imagine. Yeah, that was great overview. And I really love that last slide about where do the tools sit and obviously, you know, Chronosob is on the workflow side, so that's the part I'm quite interested in. And when I had this initial discussion with Catherine and she was talking about the author bill of rights, my first question was like, surely there's a tool out there that does that for you. And she was like, oh, I never thought about that, you know. and when we spoke, Nick, we were talking specifically about that, looking at citations in context. Like I knew there's reference checkers out there that check, obviously, you know, is the structure of the citation correct, but actually looking whether it supports the claim. So doing that text analysis, which I think is really interesting. And I see certainly on the tool side that things like the peer review systems, as you say, integrate with other different you know, new tools that come in, like integrity checks, and you know, and like get it all in one place within the workflow to make it accessible. And obviously, you know, I would say based on that, the kind of prime use case for who should be using these tools is on the editor side. Would you agree with that?
That's where we are seeing a lot of appetite for these tools, yes, purely because of the overwhelm. They are right in the middle of this back and forth between authors and peer reviewers, and yeah, there's a huge amount of strain on the system. So any tools which can help them figure out what to focus on are really interesting right now.
And should, or are those tools being extended to peer reviewers as well?
Well, this is such a rapidly evolving area. It's so new. They absolutely are. I think, we're still very much undecided what the industry standard's going to have, how things are going to play out. But there is huge appetite for tools all around. So peer reviewers, absolutely.
And I want to just jump in to say, I do think this has to come back to the authors, because, you know, even back to your point, Inka, about how do we train people, having some of the examples that you showed, Nick, so clearly articulate, does that citation support the statement you made? And if so, great. If not, did you write the sentence wrong? Did you pick the wrong reference? What is the problem? Why is there a disconnect? So, and I could imagine also like PIs wanting to vet, you know, a first draft of a paper from their student. You could just run it through this program and say, oh my gosh, these references are a mess. Go back and try again, you know, without having to themselves invest a ton of time. I think there's tons of potential there.
But can I also bring in, but AI itself, you know, I'm limited, my knowledge here is limited, can also introduce biases again. So if we all use one tool, then we might, you know, narrow our selection. So, I mean, I don't want to make it more complicated, but from my understanding, that's another really important thing to look at. And maybe it's good if we all use slightly different things so that we don't converge on the lowest common denominator, to put it very bluntly, which isn't, you know, but you know what I'm saying, right? I think that's a consideration that I think has to be part of this discussion.
Yeah, and this is again the tension between our morality and our standards and what the tools offer. And I think one thing that's clear when you speak to lots of different editors or authors or people in different domains of science is we have different standards. We have different things we're looking for when we review papers. And ideally, the tools would be able to understand, look, I'm really just focused right now on whether the metadata is correct, and that's kind of yes or no. But then I'm going to be focused on, okay, did they cite papers which I know to be relevant, and I can inform my tools about my knowledge there. And I think that customization, that configurability, is maybe one way round this sort of, we're all going to use one tool, it's all hard coded to be biased in one direction. But maybe I'm a bit of an optimist on this, so maybe that's still yet to come.
Yeah, because there's obviously a lot of talk on AI being biased, and it depends what the sources are, and you know what the training material is and what you feed into it, and that's what will be based on. And I mean, for your checks, Nick, your organization, do you use like an open AI in terms of source material, or is it limited to scholarly content?
So I think, seeing as you mentioned OpenAI, I think it's worth saying that one of the challenges we've had to solve is because of the sensitivities around data ownership and privacy, not just in publishing, but actually everywhere. We've had to basically prevent ourselves or anyone we work with from using these external large providers like OpenAI or other popular ones. So we do have to basically find our own path when it comes to data and work with publishers to figure out what's available, what we can use, and that's a sort of discussion that's ongoing. It's what the newer class of tools is really data driven. So the more data you can provide, and that'll be private, but you can train your own system, the better the results are going to be. And I think that's what's going to drive people, is actually you need to put data in for it to understand what you want it to do.
Yeah, in terms of training. There's a question for you as well, Nick, whether you could talk a little bit about how tools look at irrelevant references, as in they look at the source, they look at what is being cited, they look at do they look at abstracts of that paper and then compare it to the text that precedes it?
Yeah, exactly. What we're doing is, I think, trying to emulate a motivated and rigorous fact checker human. You know, what you do, you read a passage of text, you see a citation, you're going to go and track down that citation by clicking through, or finding the URL. You're going to read it, you're going to find the relevant passages, or you're going to try to, and then you're going to come up with a sort of an explanation as to why you think this is or isn't relevant. We try to lean away from actually saying this is irrelevant, because we're at an early stage with these tools. I think the industry needs to be very careful not to try and put hard labels on these things. I think what we need to do is figure out how to surface the information that reviewers and editors need to see for them to make a really quick decision. So if I want to decide whether something's relevant or not, I basically don't want to have to click through to every single of your, what used to be 50, but is now more like 100 references, to Catherine's point. I just want to be able to see in context the relevant information from the paper, and maybe we'll provide some scores there so that we can see, these ones we think are really relevant. So, if you're going to check anything, maybe check these few ones. So, but it is a simple process. It's difficult to automate, but it's nothing opaque. We're just hunting down source material, looking at it, and trying to come up with the right conclusion.
Mm-hmm. And in your introduction, Nick, sorry to keep picking on you, you talked about, serving institutions as well as publishers. So some of the tools are already available for institutions, and I think that's where I'd love to hear from Inke, about using any tools. How can we make, not just within the publisher workflow, but broaden that, and whose responsibility is it? So do you provide access to any institutions?
That was a question for me. Well, yes. Well, absolutely. We're at very much a piloting stage. I think one of the questions for us, you mentioned this already, is there's the actual tools, there's the capabilities, there's the technology, but there's also how do you integrate it into the workflow? And this is bread and butter for us. So I think our question on the institution side is, are there any more integrated ways we can help? Because at the moment we have a standalone solution. It's quite nice, but I think the question of how we make this really fluid, and I think Inke's got a vision around checking what her institution produces, and I think that's what we would like to understand is what is that process and how do we integrate into it.
Sorry about that. Live.
That's okay. I wonder, is it, would it be institutions that get access to a tool where they can check any submissions, any accepted papers, any papers that come out from them? Or would it be publishers that say, here's a tool, I want you to use this? Like, how do we get it to the institutions? And are there even people available that have time to do that?
I think that's a really important question. And I think for all this and other things we need to check, that's a question that we should all look at. But it might be that in some disciplines or in some institutions, one thing will work, and in another thing will work. But having a process that works in the sense that people use it and it produces useful outputs is going to be really important. I mean, I would like to learn, what others do, and then see, well, that will work for us or not, depending on on what it is, right? So I think that, but I feel there is no one single answer to that. But I think looking around, seeing what's been trialed.
Yeah.
And
But you've said in our prep, or you've said, I would like to check submissions from all authors at Dundee University for
I would
inconsistency.
love a tool that we could just kind of like a sausage machine is maybe not a very appropriate term, but something where automatically anything that is being put out in the world from our institution runs through various checks, because we're all under pressure. We're all doing more than fits into a day. So we do make mistakes, and we also sometimes need to learn, because we may have used a citation that wasn't appropriate. We didn't know about the one because we came to a training where they didn't use that, for example. And having an embedded process, no matter what the discipline, or something that goes out to be submitted for consideration anywhere, is checked. But where does that happen? Is it the author? Is it, I mean, you know, and how do we know that's happened? Is there an automatic process? I can think of a few stages where that might happen, but you know, that might be different in different disciplines. What about books? What about, you know, outputs, people write books, so that's a much bigger thing, but it might need different things. Artwork, you know, we have creative art. How do we do that? It needs a different input, if you know, if it's so it gets more multidimensional, into, you know, literally. So I think that would be really maybe another discussion for another forum to see what is realistic, what do we need, and why.
Yeah.
I
Because
can
I mean,
chime in from the
sorry, go ahead, Catherine.
no. From the publisher side, it's similar, Inka, that you know, we have our publishing integrity office, and it's amazing what the new tools can provide us. We can start to look at image manipulation. We can, of course, we've had plagiarism checkers for a long time. Now we may get some of these reference tools, and maybe our internal staff doesn't need to be doing all these checks themselves, but then they need to have someone who can answer editor questions. When the editors say, I don't understand what I'm looking at, I need to get trained on this tool, etc. So it's a huge investment of time, both staff and editors. And where do we find that time?
I think that's
question.
such an important issue. One of the biggest barriers we've found in trying to help introduce these tools is the big fear is we're just going to provide more work, because we're just providing more red flags. We're providing more complicated tools that you need to interact with. You know, I think this is a real problem, is that you've already got people who are really under fire, trying to deal with integrity and quality, and introducing a new tool is very intimidating. So I think there's a lot needs to be done in terms of making these very simple and integrated, and answering that question. And part of it might be that this is just the nature of how things progress. We need to gradually learn about these new tools, and it will become the norm. And it will. But Inka, go ahead.
Yeah,
I mean,
and who pays for them? Who pays?
Yeah, who pays for them? Yeah.
The
The problem we all agree on, I think,
right?
is doing it at the end is too late, because we don't want it to get to a stage that's been published and we have to retract it, because we all know what happens to that, right? So I think that's the common premise here. We need to move these things further upstream so they don't even get published. And our responsibility, you know, as an industry, and that includes institutions and tech providers and publishers, is to make sure we retain that quality of the scholarly record of what we put out there. And if that means slowing down and not publishing as quickly, I'm not saying it's everyone as quickly, but, you know, we see some organizations that have sped it up and clearly things went wrong, and, you know, don't need to name any names, but, you know, I think maybe that is that investment of time that we all need to take in. But that leads me also to my question, like, is this something that we can push to authors, right? I know authors already, we're asking a lot of things of authors as well, like who has time to do that, and they already, you know, pay for open access and they do this, that, and the other. But would it actually improve their chances of getting accepted, their chances of moving things on quicker later on, if it has passed through something, if publishers would make that tool available to authors, for example?
Yeah, I wonder, for instance, now for many papers, you have to have a list of which reagents you used, where you got. We didn't used to have that. We used to cite it, but now there's. So what has to be included by authors in publications has changed a lot. You know, the whole thing about showing all the raw data. So I kind of feel maybe if we think about it, and if those requirements shift a bit and we have to have these checks that take that into consideration, maybe in the end, I'd like my job to not be necessary anymore. Wouldn't that be nice? We'd save money long term, yeah. But the same thing might be in terms of what do journals or publishers expect has changed a lot. It can change more, and in the long term, that might save us time in lots of other spaces. So it might become doable, and it clearly can change because it has.
No, I think one thing to keep in mind from the publisher side is some publishers really love being first and provocative and doing things outside the norm. Others, get a little bit intimidated about being the first ones to say, here's another requirement to publish with us. And so we really need all of the publishers to come together and say, this is the new standard and everyone has to do this, because otherwise people will feel like I was choosing between two journals and this one doesn't have all of these things I have to check off. I'm going to go to that one because it's simpler. And I'm also noticing in the comments that there's people saying, not everyone has institutional funding or access to these tools through a publisher. So how do we level the playing field to make sure that if it is something that becomes required, how do we make it available to everyone?
I think there's a really important point there around the standards. And you can imagine in a few years, we've come together and come up with a badge, that this is a gold standard agreement of what checks we do and what standards we meet. And I've it's regulation, right? We're doing this for the good of everyone. These are the rules we've agreed on. Here's a common self-citation limit that we, some basic questions which differ everywhere right now. It would be a lot simpler if we could just all agree on some standards.
But then if we do that, I feel like we're going to have them, but in chemistry, this is the standard. And in humanities, this is the standard. And then we don't have a standard, right?
Yeah.
If you're trying to put numbers on it.
Mm-hmm.
I agree with you. That would be nice. That would make you, you kind of you have like an average and you can measure against that. But
you're right. It may be unrealistic.
Yeah. Or maybe the tools would be able to tell us, okay, this person really is a pioneer and they're self-citing a lot, but it's because they're the only one working in this field. And so it's appropriate. Whereas this person is self-citing because they're ignoring 98% of the people working in the area. Maybe the tools can get to some of those deeper issues.
Yeah, that would be really interesting.
But that's like, I feel like coming back to what everyone's saying about all the AI tools, right? They're there to point things out to us, and then it's a human who needs to look at it and make an informed decision. So it's like, it's a flag, and yes, it can help us say, okay, this is clear, but this might be an issue. But then you as a person, you use your brain, the referee, they know the context, right? They can then say, actually, no, this is fine. So we should never rely just on the tools, right?
Yeah.
Well, what's interesting is every circumstance that can happen will happen, right? So you're right, Romy, but people will absolutely be relying entirely on tools to decide what papers to include or publish or not. Hopefully there will be many journals and so on that will always have a human in the loop and will keep those at a higher standard. But there is going to be a lot of tools. People are going to be relying on tools, and I think the question how that's going to play out, I mean, I think it's questions.
I don't know. Then what is worth? You have some papers that are being, if they're entirely written by an AI, let's say it's correct what they say, does it make a difference? If it's correct, then it would be the same with any other tools. As long as it's correct, then it's just as bad, right? I feel like there needs to be some human interaction.
Well, so let's say it's an AI generated paper and it's correct, you say. Let's say actually it ticks all the boxes, right? It's novel, it's correct, it has an impact, and then it's reviewed by an AI and it's accepted. Is that a future we want?
No, I don't think so. I think, that, the comment about, does it matter if you used an AI tool in writing your content. Like if you use an AI assistant in, you know, improving the language of your paper, for example, does that really matter? And you have these like, you know, differences. And yeah, I don't think that is a future that we want, even if it was correct.
Interesting.
There was a really nice comment from Tansy about even between when I was talking about all the publishers should get together, they were pointing out some of the small independent publishers, you know, what's realistic for like an ACS to pay for as a tool may not be realistic for a much smaller society or other independent publishers. So again, coming back to the kind of that equity and who's on the playing field.
Yeah, I really see like a collaboration like the STM Integrity Hub, where you have the publishers that have money, put in money and make it available to everyone as a way to go. Because I agree, not everyone will have, you know, the money for those tools, but then it's also the time. You still need someone to look at it, I think.
Right. Right.
We do have another question for you, Nick. How often are reference tools updated considering the volume of papers published every day, and conversely, how far back in time do they go?
Yes, well, the way we approach it is, like I said, we try and emulate the human workflow of checking. And in that workflow, you would go and look it up on the internet. You'd actually go, if you had an institutional access, you would go to the publisher and you would pick up that paper if it was available. And we did the same thing. So we don't. A very common way of viewing tools which use AI is that they're kind of trained at a certain time, and then that's it. Behind that date or in front of that date, they're not going to be useful. But we don't. We'll basically just try to feed in. We feed in any information which is available at the time it's being used, and I think that is how a lot of people are trying to do it these days. So it's more of we use AI, but we use it more as a kind of decision assistant or a summarizer. You know, we basically, all the content is real time. So there's no, it's not out of date. It's, you know, if we're you cite a source now, we're going to go and look at the current state of that paper on the publisher's website now. We're going to pull that in. So yeah, everything's up to date in that regard.
And we have a question for you, Catherine, from Tansy. And when there's a complaint regarding insufficient or cherry-picked citation or similar misconduct, how do you view the role of the publishing editorial team versus the role of the academic editorial board in assessing or investigating these complaints? And for Inka as well. Do you want to go first, Catherine?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I would say the person who needs to have kind of that first pass is the scientific expert. You know, from our side, the integrity office, for example, can provide support, you know, be looking things up, almost kind of like Nick's AI tool, right? Like, here is the context, here is past history, here are our policies, but we need someone who really has a grasp of the field to say, oh yeah, they really are cherry picking. There's a lot more that, you know, either needs to be represented to show the breadth of the field, or to show the like other discrepancies, and maybe they're making the situation sound too rosy. So yeah, we love our, you know, our active professors who are our editors are the ones who are deep in the field and really up to date on the literature. So they're our first kind of line of defense.
And I think from a research integrity officer on the ground, is if this is a complaint or an issue that is raised with us, it's really difficult to establish, you know, how wrong is it? And where does that fit in transgressions and the sort of slippery slope that we know exists, from honest mistake to poor practice to, you know, maybe something even worse than poor practice and deliberate misconduct. And that making that judgment, particularly in this space, I think is very hard. It's hard in all areas. It's because what are the standards? We come back to what is the standard? Who is right? Who isn't right? I think some of the extreme cases of self-citations or citation mills, where you have a whole group that does that, is is possibly there might be tools. I'm sure there are tools out there to sort of, because you run various people and you go, they all look like this and this one does that. If you look at the connections, and you can get there. But I think we still have a problem at what do we define as offenses, so to speak, punishable offenses in the research misconduct space. I think that, in particular in citation, is still, we're not sure, and we need to all work together to kind of do that. If that happened in my world, I would just say, well, we need to analyze it. We need to, then we do a careful analysis, and then we look at all the details. And usually, in my experience, if people deliberately do things that are totally not okay, there will be evidence in other areas that relate not just to citations, but other things. And that's what we then look at, and we go, look, this, okay, we now have enough to look at a formal process. But it's really tricky, particularly in this space, comes back to standards.
Yeah.
And also knowing how to, if you do find something wrong, do you make a correction? Do you do an addition? Do you do a retraction? Do you do a withdrawal? Do you do nothing? How do you deal with it on the, in terms of the public record?
And what are the consequences for authors, right?
Right.
Do you, as a publisher, would you say, actually, we have evidence of misconduct? We don't, next submission we get from you, no thanks. What do you do as an institution?
Well, so for us, I mean, the way I think this is where working together is really important. And I've worked, in my role, I feel that what to do about something where our team and to our various processes has found something that is just makes the data questionable. I'm just going to keep it in very general terms. Again, is to cover the whole area. We then write to the journal. We say, look, this is the story. This is what's happened. This is what we've done. This is what we found. What would you like to do? Because we feel we have done our process, and unless it was blatant conduct when they're disciplinary or other things, but in terms of correcting the record, that to us sits with the journal, with the editors, with the publisher, because it is when it's published, it is there. It's not, and that working together is what I would like to do. But I feel I can only recommend something, and I can give you the data because that's the data. But in the end, it is your journal. You have certain things, and that's where that final decision, in my opinion, sits.
Final decision is fascinating, because the way I've approached this from a technology point of view is there are things you can observe, right? You can observe the frequency of self-citation. You can observe the fact that they may be not citing a certain paper, but they are citing this paper. But that's completely separate from like Inka was saying, that what's an honest mistake versus misconduct. You could be just unaware. Cherry picking, such a loaded term, right? You've accidentally missed a key paper, or you have deliberately excluded it to strengthen your argument. They look the same. They are just one reference missing. But the reason why it's done is the difference between academic honesty and dishonesty.
But I think that is exactly why this area is so difficult.
Yeah.
And in our world, we always initially assume you're innocent, and we just assume if we can demonstrate it's a one-off mistake. If this happens 10 times in a row and there's other evidence to suggest, then we begin to be suspicious. And there's actually a question in the chat. When we identify misconduct, who in the production chain other than the author is liable? I think, again, it depends on what it is. It's usually the person who did the dirty, to just use, again, I'm sorry, I'm using all these words, but I mean, I think I'm trying not to be so pejorative in the language, but that's where it starts. If circumstances are identified where people willingly ignored something and didn't do their job, then it becomes slightly more messy. But it's usually the author to start with.
And it does get back to the question of, editors and referees and sometimes staff have their eyes on a paper. If they miss something, we know people are so busy. And so if we shame and blame the editors and referees, will everyone just stop being editors and referees because they don't want to take on that onus? but it is their responsibility to be checking too.
Mm.
But I
One
mean,
thing I was,
yeah,
go ahead.
Sorry.
No, a slight diversion. One thing I'm interested in is how many of the citations that show up in, grounded AI or other tools analysis as this citation doesn't make sense. How many of those came from referee suggestions? I don't know if there's any way to track that down, but it would be
Well, I
interesting.
think there ultimately will be. Yeah,
With
there's
a
a
minute
very
to go, we probably don't have time.
I wanted to, because Catherine used the word shame. I think there's another things that I would really like to change in our landscape is currently the reason a lot of this is so difficult and we have issues is that it is unbelievably shameful to be found guilty even of honest mistakes.
Yeah.
I think we need to change our mindsets and hopefully get more trust in our community. We do look at this because our aim is to correct the record.
Mhm.
And people who are found to have mistakes where things have to be corrected, well, many, and I'm working, they're grateful because they want that to be happy. They're driven by getting it right. They got it wrong for whatever reason. So, to be able to look, yeah, I'm glad somebody found this, let's fix it.
Yeah. But a lot of people
Shifting
say there are no consequences for people that deliberately do things. Obviously, if you
I
can't
know that
determine whether it's
true.
deliberate or not, but that's the other side of it, right? I totally agree with you. Honest mistake, fix it. But if you deliberately do something, shouldn't there be some kind of consequence?
If it's shown, absolutely. And I can tell you there are. But
Okay.
the other issue of that is that maybe are not always, and it isn't always made public because of all kinds of other things. But that sounds like I'm hiding it. I don't want to, but that is maybe a discussion for another day.
Yeah. And I know I hear stories from publishers who say we contact institutions and they just try and bury it, right? They don't want to act on it because it looks bad for them. So I think we have on both sides, we have kind of players who play one way or the other. But yeah, this has been so interesting, and I'm sorry we could talk another half hour about this, I'm sure.
Yeah.
I just want to give you all a chance before wrapping up, just to give us what's your kind of final takeaway or your kind of key message that you want to get across before we wrap up. Inka, do you want to start?
I mean, I think I already said it. For me, it's to do everything we can, given the tools or whatever we have to work together to correct anything that's been done wrong and to develop tools so we minimize the issues going forward and we make it very difficult for people to cheat and to help many of us really do try to make this better.
Catherine?
Yeah, I love your comment, Inka, about the shift we need in the mindset. And I would go further that, we talked earlier about the incentives for people to increase their citations, either as researchers or journals or what have you, that so much of that is now baked into how we evaluate researchers and their success. And we really need to take a deep look at that. That would help us get away from some of these problems.
Nick?
So I really believe in the role of technology in helping us deal with the work involved. We have to solve these morality and questions around standards and what we want to detect and what we want to do with that data. But technology is absolutely required to help us deal with so much data that we need to check. So I would just call out the fact that if anyone's interested in trying to guide that future, I would really appreciate reaching out, because this is early, but I think there's a lot of progress we can make on tools to help deal with these issues.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with you, and I think it's quite exciting to see so many different things play out and how they can all feed into each other and who can access them in which way. I think that's something I'm quite interested in as well. So yeah, just leaves it for me to say thanks everyone. Here's a couple of links to some of the resources that we have if you want to be kept up to date on any other future webinars. This is the last one of the year. I don't know yet what's happening next year, but I'll be communicating it through the list. So please join the event list or the newsletter list if you want to be kept up to date. And if you have any other remaining questions, feel free to drop me an email. I'll pass it on to our speakers. And thank you, all of you guys. Thanks so much for joining today. This has been so great. Great to have you online. Thanks for taking the time.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so much.
Thank you, Romy.
See you.
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye.